Well, hey everybody, it's Romania Black, and I feel like we are treading into no man's land this episode because I haven't watched the preview, and we're on episode 19 of Revolutionary Girl Utena, and we've basically run through all the student council members that could be affected by the Black Rose Boys. The only exception is Toga, if he can get out of his slump, or if they go off and find Sionji like Anchorman or something. But I don't know. Now that I don't know if Sionji or Toga will be invoked in this episode. I haven't watched the preview, so I have no clue. Or if we're gonna focus on Mamiya and Soji, or if we're gonna focus on Akio. There's a lot that we don't know. So there's a lot of don't know where we're going with this, so we're gonna have to just find out. But I have a lot of comments to get through, so we need to just dive right in and talk about these comments. They're relating back to episodes 13 and 14 if you are curious to know where I'm at as I'm filming. So a lot of the comments will probably talked about things that I would address in future episodes, so I didn't really want to focus on them. But there were a couple that I thought were really interesting, so I felt they needed to be brought up. HBanana7 points out that every time a rose overlaps key moments, I'm reminded of how Japanese mangas were censored in my country in the 90s. Anytime there was a kiss scene or anything sexual, there would be this huge flower in the middle of the panel, and I've seen that happen, actually. It was ridiculous times. Thinking back, those flowers only magnify what they were trying to hide. Yeah, I agree entirely. I remember seeing something very similar back when I was reading manga in the late 90s. And it kind of ties back to the whole thing with Sailor Moon of making Sailor Uranus and Neptune cousins instead of just letting them be women that like each other. I was like, you didn't do anything. In fact, not only did you not mask what you were trying to censor, you got your audiences more curious as, why was this weird thing done? And then that just made them go look it up and find out anyway. So it's like, what was the point? You should have just let it happen and it wouldn't have been such a big deal. So I absolutely understand where you're coming from, H-Banana. Just ridiculous. Molly McDougal. I keep forgetting that Utena is not in high school. Because we talked about this in various comments. I'm like, the way that they drew characters in the 90s, specifically with anime and manga, and it's not really anyone's fault. It was just a style back then, but everyone looks like they're 25. Everyone! And that even carries on into manga and anime now, but in the 90s especially, everyone was 6'7", they had giant long legs, and then you'd read a bio and it'd be like, they're 5'3", and I'm like, bullshit, they are. And so then you would be like, wait, what? And everyone looked way older than they appeared to be. So Molly McDougal says Utena isn't even a freshman. She's a second year in the middle school. And I'm like, okay, Mickey's a first year, Utena's a second year. Oh my God. Like, you just forget that these characters are so young. So I feel like I needed to put that in because I said in the comments, I've been referring to Utena as a high schooler these last few episodes. She's not. That makes the stuff with Anthe even more sinister, and I don't like it unless Anthe's not really as young as she claims to be, which we don't know that yet. Anyway, Jimmy Russell pointed out a couple things. Jimmy Russell 1407 said Akio is dangerously smooth, continuing the exploration of different ages and their differences. You can tell the difference between a 17-year-old Playboy wannabe with a bunch of teen girlfriends like Toga and a grown adult. And it's creepy to quote exactly, as fuck. Yes, I agree. I think that it is super creepy. That's what creeps me out, I think, the most about Akio is that he is an adult. And so him preying on possibly his middle school sister and others is very predatory and it's very creepy and I don't like it. Whereas Toga's just like a Playboy wannabe, like Jimmy said. He's just trying to fit the part, which we'll talk about here in a second. But it's like, okay, he's 17 years old. What 17-year-old person have you met that doesn't try to do some shit like that? It's like, okay, it's you want to shake him, but it's not so much as Akio, who isn't a grown adult, that's like, this is not cool. Your brain has, cognitively stopped growing at age 25. You should know better. So we'll just wait and see. Who knows? But Jimmy Russell also points out, personally, I don't think it's just about skewed memories and unreliable narrators. Well said. It's about fitting roles. The show clearly has a big inspiration in theater, from the Greek chorus to references of the Takarazuka Review, which we've talked about in previous episodes. The show starting with a curtain opening, which ties back to Utena's, like, the memory of, the story about her parents dying and everything. So I heavily suspect that it isn't just about having faulty memories, but about just remembering the role of the character in the memory without remembering the specific actor. Like when Utena considered Toga to be possibly the prince, even though it makes little sense in appearance and time frame, I think Utena forgot about the appearance of the prince. She forgot the actor and just felt that Toga maybe fit the role. And we've talked about that in previous episodes, so that's not new stuff. But similarly with Mickey and his sister back in episode 14, he forgot the actual actor, specifically how badly suited his sister was for his made-up ideal, which we've talked about in previous episodes as well in the discussion, and just tried to find Anthy to fit the role. I really think who and when doesn't matter. It's just that a play has multiple actors, but it matters more about the what and how. Yeah, I don't think, Jimmy, you're saying anything that I haven't already considered and talked about in the discussions, so I've not repeated them. But yeah, I feel like Anthy is fitting a role, and we've talked about that in previous episodes. And so it's just the idea of we don't exactly know what has caused this role, why she's so heavily defined and changed to it. That's not been explained. And we don't know why Mamiya wants to be in that role because it seems very restrictive. And like you wouldn't want to be in it to begin with, but he wants to somehow. And so there's a lot of variables there to consider. I do think it is about skewed memories and unreliable narrators as well, but it can also be about the roles as well. So nothing new or revolutionary, but I liked the way that Jimmy phrased that in their comment. El Freya says that Anthy, and now this is going to refer to a series called Madoka Magica, so I'm going to say it and you're probably going to be like, who's that character? But I highly suggest, it's only 12 episodes in a movie, go watch my reactions to Puella Magi Madoka Magica. It was the series that came before this one. They fit together quite well. I love that series so much. It says, Anthy feels a bit like Kyubey, too, with her knowledge, only telling you enough to know what the question is, but keeping a majority of what she knows to herself. Yes, and we've talked about that in previous discussions. Rantiki, I thought this was really interesting because I have read Shakespeare, and Hamlet is one of the most adapted Shakespearean works of his catalog. So Rantiki says, I believe the lyrics of Kane's duel song is interpolated with a Hamlet verse. In Act 1, Scene 4 of the play, Hamlet meets the ghost of his deceased father and says the following, which is interpolated in this duel song. Hamlet, be thou a spirit of health, or goblin damned. Bring with thee airs from heaven or blasts from hell. Be thy intents wicked or charitable. Thou comest in a questionable shape, that I will speak to thee. What may this mean? Thou art dead, course. Again, in complete steel, revisitest thus the glimpses of the moon, making night hideous, and we fools of nature, so horridly to shake our disposition with thoughts beyond the reaches of our souls. It looks like the English subs here just directly quote the original Shakespearean Hamlet verse verbatim, whereas the original Japanese is more of an interpolation, or I guess translation, of the original Hamlet verse. Either way, I think it's an important thing to take away from this duel song that's alluding to Hamlet. The question is, why is Kane's duel song specifically referencing Hamlet? Well, because Kane being the engaged or fiance, I think that it's important. I could personally maybe tie Kane to Ophelia, perhaps from Hamlet, who is the lover of Hamlet, and she gets the shaft throughout that entire play. Hamlet is this colossal protagonist that really only cares about himself, and he just uses people around him to get revenge and to extract his own agenda. So Ophelia, unfortunately, becomes kind of a pawn of that. So if you were going to invoke Hamlet, I would say that Kane is kind of the Ophelia equivalent throughout, because Akio may be engaged to her, but I don't think he really cares about her at all. I think she's just a means to an end, which we talked about in the episode. So I thought that was interesting, though. You can relate so much back to Hamlet. I have ruined many a series for my parents by telling them that this is basically Hamlet, and they're like, shut up. Quit being an English major. And I'm like, but... So then finally, we have Oliver Jajado. And they have this week's director's commentary is very interesting, as it's about the inspiration for this new arc and also reveals some of Ikuhara's critical views on capitalism and modern society. Why not bring up capitalism and modern society right now in this random series about a magical girl? Why not? So 14, The Boys of the Black Rose. I saw a certain horror movie when I was in middle school. There was a secret mortuary in an underground chamber, and the dead were electronically transmitted, still in their coffins, to the other world, where they were forced into slavery. Oh, which kind of ties to the whole workings of the chamber and the Black Rose and possessing people, whatever. The movie story was utterly absurd, but the division of the world into opposite poles of living and dead felt real to me somehow. Our world has been spoken of in bipolar fashions for ages. Oh, yeah, absolutely. In my student days, there was a popular book that compared the affluent with the non-affluent and sorted everything into categories called loaded and broke. It was the bubble era, and the aim of the book was probably to get a laugh by saying, they call us wealthy, but our lifestyle's practically in the trash can. But for some reason, I couldn't laugh. Years later, the phrase the winning side was popular in the media. I thought it was horrid. And sure enough, people started using the opposite phrase, the losing side, as a masochistic joke. I still couldn't laugh, though. One day, a girl I saw on TV said, there are only two types of people in this world, the ones who are chosen and the ones who aren't chosen. That gave me a start. To not be chosen is to die, said the girl. I decided to try my hand at that. The Black Rose arc. Oh, interesting. So, I mean, the idea maybe that Mamiya and Soji feel, I could see definitely in Mamiya's case, if Mamiya isn't chosen to be the Rose Bride, then what's the point of their existence, which ties back to what Jimmy Russell was talking about with roles and what everyone has. So if we're to determine in this world that you're either chosen or not chosen, and that kind of goes back to Nanami, whether she was chosen by Toga or not, or cast aside, which is to be chosen or not chosen is like, that is indicative of each story that we've been going through so far in this series. Which is great. So that's super interesting. But also the idea of, you know, you have to break the world's shell or the chick can't be born. So that's like, if you're not chosen to hatch, then you're just going to die. There's a lot of things to unpack with that and tie back to the episodes we've been watching. So, wow. Thank you, Oliver Jajado. That's super interesting. How about that? Nice. So yeah. Okay. Those were all amazing comments. Thank you all so much. I super appreciate it. But yeah, we need to dive into this episode. Real quick before we start, I haven't done this on Utena for a while, but I want to give a special shout out over to our philanthropy tier over on Patreon, because you all, especially Anthony, helps me get the files each week, but you all have helped me to be able to react each week and keep my channel afloat. So I appreciate that so much. And I want to give a shout out to the philanthropy tier members this week, which are Alex Cornejo, Anime Annie, Be Happy, BBT, Bryant Reed, Damage3245, Dana, Danger Zone! I love saying it like that. Devorin, Danny Donmai, Destiny Marie, Ichu Eric, Fisho, Ghostly Turnip, El Freya, Liam Poles, Lyndon, Matthew Palfinier, Murphew, Nameless Monster, Nicholas, Sunspots, Shimoyama, Trails, Translucent Men, Alexander Q, and Maroni W. Thank you all so much for your support, and I really appreciate it. All of my love. Y'all are great. So yeah. All right, it's been 13 minutes. We need to dive in and just see what we get. But we are going to start episode 19 of Revolutionary Girl Utena. And we're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1, and let's go. I'm sorry, what? When has Wakaba and Sayonji had interactions? No, hold on. From the beginning. She was the one that wrote him the love letter. She wrote a love letter to Sayonji, and he supposedly shared it with everybody. Oh! Holy shit, during the ED, I was so like, what's happening? Because I did not at all expect to see Sayonji at all. And then he showed up and I was like, okay, what? When did this? But no, okay, so back in episode 1, the very first duel that happened in the series, oh my god, it was because Wakaba had wrote a love letter. She was confessing to Sayonji. Okay. And then he supposedly ignored it. He ignored it because he was with Anthe and discarded her feelings. Okay. Because he was after Anthe and the Rose Bride. Okay. But since his quote unquote exile, and he's not exchanging the diary anymore with Anthe, since that moment he's been away. But supposedly he's been staying with Wakaba? And they've been a thing? Okay, we're going to have to go through this episode because now with the ending with him, that I don't know where we're going from this, but we have a lot to talk about and we need to break this all down. And Huckleberry is going to demand that I throw this ball as I do so. That's fine. Oh my God. So now in the context of this episode, knowing the very end of it, that kind of recontextualizes everything. So let's start with that. Let's start with that and kind of go through symbolic elements. As we've talked about in this series, and hopefully y'all can hear me, there is a lot of concept of memory. Memory is really important in this episode, like really important, and we're going to talk about it. Memory, roles, those are the two main ones there, and this concept of relationships. Viva la revolution. So anyway, we're going to point out some symbolism and things that point out here. We start out with this like very elaborate castle, like this very elaborate. So we have this castle. It is different, to be noted, than the one we've seen in previous flashbacks, things like that. There is like a little glass mosaic window, which is pink and green, which is interesting. I don't know what that's referring to, but there's a castle. There's also a moon, which we have tied to relationships, even siblings. But we know that Wakaba and Saionji are not siblings, so it's not that, okay? So we tied that to that. Okay, cool. Great. So anyway, we have this story that reflects to Wakaba because the rose is kind of like a burnt orange, but she's sitting there. What's important to note is that her prince is in the shadows. So the prince in the shadows refers to the fact that we don't know his identity, which is relevant because it's going to come up in this episode quite a lot, but we don't know his identity as the story stands. I do love Wakaba it's the same dress that we see Utena and Anthe in, only it's yellow. And she's like, I waited so long to meet you. My whole life has led up to this encounter with you. Interesting. She's like, don't you think so, my prince? Mm-hmm. So anyway, there was a lot of bait and switch in this episode from what I thought was going to happen. Like when we start out, so Wakaba's always had, we're going to put Wakaba up here and kind of talk about her whole relationship. First of all, I really have come to like Wakaba as a character. When this series started out, I thought she was going to be just like the comic relief character, and she was just going to be there to be kind of like annoying, but not really in on anything. And Wakaba has really become a pretty fleshed out character. Like she has her moment to shine as MVP in episode 12 with the whole situation with Toga, which, because of her standing up to Toga, that's a good point there to say up that she stands up to Toga, which could be a connection with Saionji in itself because Saionji is close friends with Toga. So there's that. I'm sure Saionji would be very impressed that she stood up to Toga. So good for her. But she also is literally Utena's BFF, right? She's her BFF, right? If nobody, you got to get through Wakaba before you get to Utena, right? So, and honestly, Wakaba, considering that Ikuhara has worked on Sailor Moon in the past, in season 1 and throughout the series, but really in season 1, there is a lot of preferences with, I think the Japanese name for her is Naru, but in the English dub, which is what I grew up with, her name was Molly. That was her English dub name, was Molly. She had a very over-exaggerated Brooklyn accent, where she'd be like, oh, Serena, you gotta go get with Prince Darien. Like she had a very over-the-top Brooklyn accent, and I was living for it as a kid. I thought that was what all people from New York sounded like. And oh, how wrong I was, but you'll just come over here, you. It was great. But anyway, in season 1, she falls in love with a member of the Negaverse, which is Nephlite, who I had a major crush on as a kid. I was like, that long curly brown hair. He was kind of a bad boy, but he had a heart of gold underneath, and he helped out Molly, even though he was really kind of tsundere about it. Like, I was like, all about that type as a kid. Yes, please. And so they had a relationship in that series. And honestly, when we see Saionji at the end, it reminded me of Nephlite, and it reminds me of her and him. So I don't know where that's going to take us, but I instantly went to that comparison, and I'm like, oh my God, yes, I thought he was Nephlite from the start, and that all makes sense. Holy shit. So yeah, I want to say that with Wakaba, she's like, something good happened. She's like, yes, something good happened. And so what's interesting is that whole something good, we don't really know what exactly that means at the beginning of the episode. It could be that she was invited to stay and get in a relationship with Saionji. That could have been the relationship with Saionji, and we didn't even know about it, right? But she's in a good mood, and she gets Utena like all the skewers. I do love that the little toothpicks holding the little octopus hot dogs are like, they have roses and everything. Super cute. Like, she goes out of her way to do all these really nice things for Utena. And I feel like, I know a lot of people might say that Wakaba has a crush on Utena. To me, this is like best friend behavior, because Wakaba and Utena kind of remind me of myself and my best friend. Like, we would do anything for each other, and we constantly are like, yeah, best friends forever. You go on a date this person, you got to get through me, sort of thing. And it can come across like a relationship, but it's really platonic, right? Because I think Wakaba, she just really likes Utena and wants the best for her. And she's like, Wakaba is very happy to have made this pretty little lunch for her dearest, most beloved Utena-sama. Yeah, they're just like really good friends. And she's like, oh, you're a girl through and through. You're going to make such a good bride someday. And she's like, right, you said it. Right? She's like, these little octopus wieners are a work of art. So, I mean, what I like about it is they're so open with one another. And she's like, you're going to be a good wife to somebody someday. And she's like, I know, right? Like, and honestly, there's nothing wrong. I feel like when people think of #feminist, they think that feminists are not, for women being like wives or housemakers or things like that. I don't believe that that's the case. I think if you want to choose to be a housewife and you want to choose to do that, that's totally fine. There are some people that are really good at that and they really enjoy that. But the aspect of it that is important is that your partner isn't condescending or tries to make you subservient in those roles, right? Because I'm sorry, I'm doing your laundry, I'm cooking you your food, be grateful. And so I feel like there should be some equality there. Like, that the person shouldn't view it as that's your job. It's that, oh, you like to do that and you like to provide. Cool, great. Here's how I can do that in return and make for a healthy relationship. I do get a little bit concerned. Saionji looked pretty chill in that last panel. He looked like he was doing all right for himself, like maybe getting away from Toga, and that toxicity was a good thing for him. Great. But thinking back on it now, the only thing I can think of is Saionji bitch slapping Anthe every time we saw them together. And I'm like, don't be doing that to Wakaba now. Don't be acting that way to Wakaba. She don't deserve that. So it's going to be interesting to see if we see Saionji with Wakaba and if he's changed. And if he has changed, what does Utena and Anthe do with that? So that's going to be a really good question. We're going to have to check that out. But anyway, so then Tatsuya comes across. He's like Kazami Tatsuya, and he's a second year like them, and he brings a love confession letter. And of course, Wakaba takes it, and she's like, "Oh, really?" And she's like, "Don't take it personally." He's like, "Oh yeah," and then of course, I like that Utena says, "Well, I'm not really the type that's gonna date you," but she doesn't finish the sentence. So what I think is important about this moment is Utena coming to the realization she's starting to admit that she doesn't want to date. I'm gonna put men in quotation marks because so far she's turned down all the men. She's like, no. So she was not having a problem with Jury running her hand up her, but. But we're not into the guys. So I feel like I am glad Utena's making some progress to kind of stand up for herself. And because in the past, she's kind of like just gave non-answers and avoided the question and been like, oh, what? I'm not dating anybody. But here she's saying I'm not the type, meaning that you're not really the type of person I want to date. And so Wakaba, she deflects the situation and then points out saying, oh, you're the onion prince, aren't you? Now, what's interesting in hindsight to all of this is that he has green eyes and greenish hair. Saionji's eyes are purple, but he has greenish hair too. So there is a question here. There is a question as far as the onion prince goes. As far as that goes for her, being that is Wakaba's prince. And we find out now that Wakaba, you know, she was made fun of because her hair and everything made her look like an onion. That's what she was made fun of. But Wakaba's prince is the one who defended her, right? And this kind of goes back to the comparison of like where Toga the prince that rescued Utena. Well, we as the audience are like, I don't think so, but he was around that time, so it would be easy to confuse, I suppose. Whereas now we have to say, you know, was Tatsuya really the one that was the knight, or was it Saionji? Or is this a situation where Saionji is kind of like Toga and they're both being confused for people that they are not? So you can see this. Is the actual prince for Utena and Tatsuya, are they the actual princes, but Saionji and Toga are being confused as the princes because they put across that vibe more? I don't know. We're going to have to see. I mean, I thought that Tatsuya was the onion prince, but maybe Wakaba's just confused like Utena was and is thinking that it's Saionji because she met up with Saionji first. Who knows? We'll have to see. But anyway, she talks about how she's known Tatsuya since elementary school, and she's like, it does seem familiar. So the episode's called Song of the Fallen Kingdom, which is a very weird episode title. I'm like, I'm going to be definitely interested in Oliver Jajado's commentary from Ikuhara about the name of it, if there was a specific meaning to that name particularly. To me, Song of the Fallen Kingdom, it's like, is the song referring to confusing a prince for something else or getting your princes mixed up? Is it that the prince didn't live up to the expectation? I'm very curious to see what we end up getting out of that name. But anyway, so they're like, what's the onion prince? And she's like, he's like, I missed my chance to return the letter. And she's like, well, I can give it back. And she's like, no. She's like, we got to take it back to him. And she's like, he's not the type of guy you should be paying attention to, but don't let your guard down. He'll trick you with his smooth talk. And Utena's like, okay, do I look like somebody who would be persuaded by that? So then Wakaba says he's the same as he was back then, where she refers to Tatsuya as a smooth talker, which kind of makes me think of Toga, and also a womanizer, which kind of makes me think of Toga. And I wouldn't be surprised if she's with Saionji, because both Saionji and her have experiences with people that love them that are hiding it through their actions. So if you were to tell me that Tatsuya actually does love Wakaba, but he's been hiding that love by doing all of the other things because he just didn't confess and get up the nerve to do it, I would believe you. If you told me that Toga was compensating for his love of Saionji by flirting with all these women he don't actually care about, I would believe you. So, do I think that Wakaba and Saionji should stay together? I personally right now don't think so. I think that both of them are kind of in denial of their actual princes, which are Tatsuya and Toga, and they need to go and talk to each of them individually and confess and get it sorted out. But we can't have nice things. So that's not where we're at. But she's like, oh yeah, he's a smooth talker just the same as he was. He was always chasing tail and going around flirting with girls. And Utena's like, oh, come on. Guys like him give men everywhere a bad name. She's like, don't you think you're taking that a bit too far? She's like, he's heartless. And then she's like, yeah. And then Wakaba says, he's just plain heartless. Now, to me, That makes me think like Saionji and Wakaba have been commiserating together, like watching old-fashioned rom-coms and being like, that Toga, he's just heartless with all these women. And she's like, I know, Tatsuya's the same way. And I'm like, you're not together. You both need to go find these people and tell them these things. But we'll just see where it goes. I didn't watch the preview, so I don't know where next week's going to take us. If we're going to continue on with this, I hope we do, because I would love to get some more insight into why Wakaba's with Saionji. And she's like, he transferred away without telling me. And again, that also feels like a connection with Saionji and Toga, because she's like, I'm mad at Tatsuya because he left me without saying anything and he went away and I lost my prince. And Saionji's like, Toga's gotten invested in all these things, but he's not involving me anymore. So it feels like he's abandoned me as well. They're both like commiserating together over abandonment. And it's like, what the fudge? And she's like, that guy used to be my prince. So she basically has kind of said that Tatsuya, so we get there, he used to be her prince. But she's suggesting that his actions now don't reflect what she wants in a prince. And so she's kind of decided to give up on him. And they're like, well, you guys are pumpkins and radishes. And then she grabs his hand and says, I have my own onion prince here with me. Now, I love when the series does weird animation choices and stylistic things that you're like, oh yes, this is an episode of Revolutionary Girl Utena. And the whole like going out of context where he's like, huh? So poor Tatsuya feels a little bit clueless. And so it seems at the time she was claiming that he was her knight and that he was her savior, and he was not on board or understanding of that relationship and was like, what are we talking about? And so she's like, well, it's an old story. And then Utena's like, well, but it seems like destiny, doesn't it? Like, don't you think? And she's like, oh, no way. So anyway, I like the scene where he comes to like get the letter back from her, but she instantly looks over and it looks like he's flirting with the girls at the doorway. And she kind of has a little bit of jealousy, which again, ties back to Saionji and Toga and that little bit of jealousy that I'm sure Saionji felt for Toga being like the womanizer that he is. And so then, of course, now granted, he doesn't do anything with those girls. He just meets her to get the letter back. And she's like, well, I don't think you all are a match. And he's like, you brought up this weird pumpkin prince or whatever in front of her. And she's like, the onion prince. And he's like, well, it doesn't matter whichever it is. And she's like, it does matter. And at this moment, she's like, it does matter. It's important to me. It doesn't matter to you, Tatsuya? So in that moment, she's like, something that was important to her, he shrugs off. Which you could say that he's just trying to be in denial of his feelings because he's afraid of rejection too. Because he says later on that she's shy, is what he quote unquote says. And so he feels like that's going to be a reason for her to leave him. And it's like, dude, if you were just owning up in the moment and just said, oh yeah, I remember what you were talking about, but I didn't know it was so important to you. If people communicated better when they were teenagers, we could solve a lot of problems. But they're teenagers and that doesn't happen. And so he looks at her and she feels sad because she's like, it's an important memory to me. And he's just kind of like, well, anyway. And I'm like, dude, don't scoff it off. I'm like, that's important to her. Like, if you like her, don't just shrug that memory off. But that's what he does. So it's like, anyway. And she's just like, well, whatever. She's like, if you really want it, I'll introduce you to Utena, but that's all. And we find out later what that ends up meaning and why he's going through this, which is the most convoluted, like, round robin way. But it happens in real life, so you know what? We'll talk about it in a second. But meanwhile, we're back to the organ music and the student council there again. I'm glad they have tables and chairs once more. Everything. What's so frustrating is that the three of them, none of them talk about what's happened to them. They don't talk about Soji or Mamiya or the fact that someone's out here doing this, or the fact that Nanami's met with Soji for his seminar. We don't talk about that. We should probably talk about that, but we're not going to bring it up. So instead, Nanami's like, hey, I'm having a party tomorrow. We're going to go dance and have fun and play games while my brother's like just in a puddle in his room. You want to go play piano for it? And he's like, sure. Like, just nothing's a thing. He's like, I'll play that piano. And so then Jury's like, speaking of playing piano, she's like, you always think about your special person when you're playing, don't you? Now, what's interesting is that he has that picture of Anthe and he gets all blushy and he's like, oh, well, no, I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, oh, Jury-san, like, don't tease me. And I'm like, what's interesting is I don't view Mickey romantically interested in Anthe at all. I honestly feel like he just likes the concept of Anthe and the role that she plays, and that he just likes her because she reminds him of something nostalgic. But then, damn, Nanami comes in with the shade. She's like, move on and think about something else when you play already. And then Mickey, like, brings it right back. He's like, well, it must be nice for you, Nanami-san. And then he says, well, you can have all your desires satisfied by an elementary schooler. I was like, the shade, the tea, all shade. Mickey had a drag queen comeback if ever there was one. I was like, damn, that was brutal. And Nanami being like, well, shut up. She's like, that's just play. I'm like, girl, you call it play now because that's what you legally have to do. And she's like, true love is something you only feel once. And that gets Jury's attention because Jury's true love that she felt one time is the one girl. So then Nanami holds up the picture of her and her brother and she's like, that's why the shape of love is eternal. And she's like, my beloved brother. And he's like, well, you mean anyone who isn't your literal brother is worthless small fry to you? And then Jury kind of laughs at that. And she's like, so you only feel true love once, you say. If you could just change the one you love as if flipping a switch, things would be much easier for the both of you. And they're both like, and then she's like, oh, well, she's like, pot calling the kettle black. The same goes for me. So yeah, all three of them are kind of hung up on this nostalgic love and the people that influenced their lives and shaped the way that they view romance, but they can't just move on. They're all kind of stuck in this arrested development when it comes to the person that they are attracted to. And I guess you could talk about in terms of roles that for Wakaba, she has this idea of what a prince is and the idea of what that role was. And she believed that Tatsuya was filling that role at the time, but now is not doing so. So what's interesting is that Wakaba's sense of the word prince is sort of transient, and it's the role that she wants to have fulfilled, but not necessarily desires for it or requires for it to be the same person, which is so interesting to me. Because Utena, on the one hand, if we're going to talk about her in this, she wants to find the prince. Like, her whole thing is finding, like, who is the one man she met as a kid that she can go back to and say, yep, this was him. Whereas for Wakaba, it's just the role of the prince that she's concerned about. She doesn't care if it's Tatsuya or if it's Saionji. She just wants to find a person that is the prince to fulfill that need. She's not looking for the specific person, which is such an interesting change. So then, speaking of Utena, I like Utena. She's real sweet. She's a badass at times, but girl, you're not flexing that middle school education, because she's like, well, I wonder if he's the Prince Wakaba can't stop talking about. And I'm like, no. I don't think it's the same person. And then Akio's like, oh, you sweet summer child. She's like, by chance, my friend reunited with her high school friend, with her childhood friend, but they're not talking things out with each other. And I wonder if maybe the prince she's waiting for is actually him. I guess she could also mean she's wondering if the guy that Wakaba is waiting for as her prince is really Tatsuya, or if it's someone different. And Akio, who's drawn kind of weird in this episode, he's like, oh, well, what a lovely story. What a non-answer. What not answering the questions are you saying, sir? And then Utena's like, well, I'm always the one talking here. I'm so sorry. And he's like, well, as you can see, Anthe's pretty silent because of her role, and I'm just trying to get to know you, enemy. So sure, I don't mind. There's a lot of tea sipping in this episode, by the way. And he's like, but however, I like that we frame it with the column window, the white rug, and the white furniture. I'm like, anybody who has all white furniture and an all white rug, beware them. Be wary. He says the insides of a person's heart is akin to something veiled in silk, which is interesting as a description. And he talks about how it may feel like you could peer through, but in reality, you cannot. So he basically gives this conversation point here to talk about how something veiled in silk, it seems easy and transparent, but that is not the case. It's very hard to tell what someone's inner heart is thinking or what their inner beliefs are. And it instantly pans over to Anthe, who's just sitting there smiling nonchalantly because she has no choice in the matter and we don't know what her actual thoughts are. And like the princes people hold within their hearts are surely beyond others' understanding. Yeah, that's kind of goes back to the point of what Utena describes as a prince being a literal person from her past she's trying to find, versus Wakaba, who seems to view the role of prince as something that is transient and not quite as concrete. It's more abstract. It's going to vary from person to person, right? And she's like, oh, I've learned something interesting. And he's like, well, I envy young people in love. I envy humans. And then he looks over to Anthe saying, I hope you too find your own prince soon, Anthe. And she's like, oh, sure, big brother. And I'm like, that is the creepiest shit. I'm like, well, you're not dictating that you're her prince, so I guess maybe that's a good thing. But why does she have to find it so soon? They're just in middle school. Leave her alone. Anyway, we go back to the cafeteria that's more populated than usual. And I like that the slurping scene where Utena is just kind of like, this was like a damn episode of Untucked on Drag Race. This whole episode is what it felt like. Because Utena's just sitting there slurping her tea. And I like that Wakaba's like, oh, well, he's not someone you would particularly want to date, but just tolerate him, right? Just tolerate him, which is not a good idea ever. So she's like, put up with him. She's like, yeah. And I like how Anthe, this entire scene, is silent, just watching Choo Choo eat. One thing that is kind of disturbing about this series is that Anthe does not ever really get a chance to vocalize her thoughts. So as Wakaba is sitting there telling Utena to put up with someone she's not particularly attracted to, here's Anthe on the other side of the table that is literally every week, every Saturday night, putting up with someone that she may or may not actually like. So it's just kind of, it feels very meta and creepy in this moment, but Utena's like, well, why should I put up with him? And she's like, fine, I guess. And she's like, but I'm not doing it for his sake. She's like, I'm doing it for you because you clearly want me to do this. So then he shows up and Utena makes a point of not only pointing out Anthe and Choo Choo, who's here. And here's the thing about, I love that Choo Choo instantly like zeroes in on Tatsuya. Also, Choo Choo switched bodies with Saionji, so maybe there's something to that. I don't know. But also what's interesting is this concept that Tatsuya is just somebody that people naturally kind of are charmed by. And I know someone in real life that's exactly like that. I had a friend named Ryan who he's just a really nice person and he's super attractive and charming. Even if you aren't romantically attracted to him, he's just very, very charming and flirty, and that's just how he is. And he's like, I know that's how I am, and that's just my personality. And so it's just like, oh, and you just find yourself very drawn to him as a person, whether you are interested in him or not. I was never romantically attracted to him, but I could see why a lot of girls were. And I was like, oh, okay, I get it. But that's just how he is. And so that moment with Choo Choo kind of seems reflective of that. And Wakaba's like, oh, damn, even the monkey's attracted to you. You haven't changed at all. She's like, you're flirting with everybody. You're always buttering up girls. And Tatsuya's like, well, that wasn't what I was intending. And I kind of felt bad for him in that moment. He's just naturally like that. He's just naturally attractive. And he's like, what's your problem? Why are you accusing me? And she's like, well, because she's like, I was attracted to you and you were my prince. And what you represented was something that I thought I could claim for myself, but that's not the case anymore, and I've realized it. So I like that Utena's like, well, I'm not dating anybody, but a prince gave me this ring a long time ago, and I still think about him. I'm trying to find him, and he's like, oh, well, a prince sounds nice and dreamy, and she's like, yeah, but it looks like the princess next to you has a prince she can't keep off her mind, and I was like, Utena! So in the moment, here's the crazy thing. In the moment when this episode was going on, I thought, oh my God, Utena, you can't just out somebody's crush. I know you're trying to get the wheels moving, but girl, like, what are we doing? And so I'm going to straighten this real quick. It's bugging me. But anyway, so she's like, oh, I'll just kind of reveal this. And I'm like, girl, this is not for you to reveal. And the moment it seemed like, oh my gosh, Utena's getting the ball rolling for Wakaba's crush on Tatsuya. But now looking back, I'm like, maybe Wakaba didn't exactly have a crush on him. She just felt like, why are you bringing this up? That was in the past. What we doing? And so Wakaba, and she's like, well, isn't the Onion Prince? And she's like, well, my prince is. And then she looks over to him and she's like, my prince is. And she kind of like, she looks at him and she's like, my prince was like you, Tatsuya, but she's like, my prince isn't you now. So Utena's like, well, why don't you be more honest with yourself, Wakaba? And she's like, oh, you're picking on me. And now it kind of makes more sense. If she was into Saionji and not him, then when she looks at Tatsuya, she's like, well, you were my prince back in grade school, but you're not now. So it's kind of hard for her to say, I've moved on from you when you're sitting right here being all flirty. She's like, and I get that. I get Wakaba's struggle, because it's like when you had a crush on somebody and they didn't reciprocate and you've moved on and suddenly they finally realize, oh, wait, actually, I do like you. It's like, you missed your chance sort of situation. So I don't know if she's going to stay with Saionji or if she's going to end up with him. I don't know. Episode 20 might be where we find that out at, but okay. But anyway, they say she acts tough, but she's also a girl, which is, you know, a little bit dated, a little bit dated and a little bit sexist. Girls can be tough. Let's not be outdated with our stereotypes. That's like saying that all men are tough, which is not true at all. So maybe she can't forget the prince she met so long ago. Well, which I think is part of it. She does remember him as her Onion Prince. So she does actually remember him, but she knows that times have changed. And so then he reveals that he has thought of her as he came there. But I'm like, dude, you thought of her as you came to the academy, but you've been flirting with other girls and not saying anything? And he's like, you know, she always looked happy when she was next to you, so I thought if I dated you that I could get closer to her. And I'm like, why y'all going in this roundabout way? Why y'all being difficult? Just talk to one another, stupid teenagers. Stupid middle schoolers. Quit making this complicated. He's like, she's just so shy. I thought she only called me Onion Prince to make fun of me, but I was wrong, wasn't I? And I'm like, well, I think so, but Utena's being nice and not specifically saying it. And then she repeats what Akio told her, and that the princes people hold within their hearts are surely beyond others' understanding. So, but I think it's worth it to confess. Which I agree. I think he should have gone and confessed to her. I think that was important. He could have been a little bit more direct in his confession, but whatever. So I honestly thought when we got to the window, to the lockers, that it was going to be like, I thought that Wakaba was going to go somehow when she ran away to the consultancy at Soji's, but that's not what happened. So this show does such a great fake out. It does a fake out like 2 or 3 times where you think something's going to happen. We're going to make this a duel. And then it doesn't end up being a duel. So we're going to talk about that. But Utena's like, I wonder if I did the right thing. And Anthy's like, with what? And she's like, well, with Tatsuya and Wakaba. And Anthy's like, when it comes to romance, whatever happens, happens. Which is such an interesting thing for Anthy to say, in that whatever will be, like, que sera, whatever will be, will be. Que sera, sera. That's interesting because it shows that Anthy is just very go with the flow with it, but also kind of like, it also seems very archaic for her, where she's like, well, I'll just do whatever happens and just go with the flow and do whatever I'm told. And I'm like, It gives me a creepy vibe when she says that. But I mean, honestly, whatever happens will happen. And Utina's like, well, that's true, but like, should I have been influencing? And then of course, Wakaba says, you're a meanie. She's like, geez. So then we have the shadow girls coming in talking about the tire shop and saying, what's a tire shop? Well, we have fish shops selling fish. Then she has bread shops with the guns, and it says they sell breads. But What the fudge is this that's supposed to be there in the moment? That doesn't look like bread. I don't understand what that's supposed to be. I'm like, what? What is happening? I don't know what that shadow is supposed to represent. It's not bread. What the fudge is it? I don't know. Is it? I can't figure out what it's supposed to be. You all in the comments will probably say something. And then we sell tires, and they kind of make the tires look like donuts. So then she's like, well, I'll take a helping of those tires. Feed your husband something invigorating. Oh, tire shop owner, how should I cook these tires up? And she's like, well, can you eat those? It's such a weird little shadow girl thing, but it's basically talking about, like, I guess my interpretation would be getting what you ask for. If you go to ask for, if you're asking for a romance, you need to be direct. Otherwise, it can be misinterpreted. I don't know. I'm curious to know your interpretations of the Shadow Girls scene there, because it seems pretty straightforward. Anyway, the entire confession scene in the sunset with the bridge and everything, it's shot beautifully. It's like probably one of my favorite animated scenes in the whole series so far. It's so gorgeous. Like, it is absolutely beautiful. And she's like standing by the tree, and it's so romantic. And it's such a fake out moment, because you're like, well, we're at the 16-minute mark, so we're almost done with the episode. What could happen? And so she's like, you sound serious. And that's when he comes up to her and he's like, well, there's somebody you like, isn't there? And she's like, what? And he says, well, you're in love with your prince, aren't you? And she says, look. And he says, you should be honest when the chips are down. She's like, I'm always honest. And he says, a prince, huh? And he's like, well, I was just thinking that you might want to know how your prince feels. And she's like, how my prince feels? And so he's not being direct enough, because she's misconstruing all this. He's like, as you finally realize your own feelings, maybe you've already realized how your prince feels too. Which could be taken as him confessing to her, but could also be taken as him being a friend and telling her to go after the man that she loves. And so she's like, oh. She's like, childhood friends are just that good, huh? And then he's like, of course. And that was the moment I was like, oh shit, he just friend zoned himself without realizing it. Because he's like giving her all this advice of telling her to follow her heart and like go after her prince. What he doesn't understand is her prince has changed. She knows that he was her prince from when they were in elementary school, but he's not her prince now. And he's just reconfirming to her, you should go after the guy that you really like. He doesn't realize it's not really him anymore. So when she says the whole childhood friends part, and he's like, of course, she's basically friend zoning him, being like, oh, well, that's so cool that you're here as my friend to give me this advice. And I'm like, oh no. And she's like, you're right. And she's like, I finally realize it. I really do love that prince. And maybe if God's on my side, that prince will turn around and look at me, which is what Saionji does at the very end. I'm like, what? So, and then she's like, maybe I can finally become happy too. And the thing is, he's standing right in front of her. So when she's like turning around, it would fit the motif of maybe when I turn, my prince will be there and he'll look back at me. And it's like, oh my God. And so he's like, well, then you understand already. And he goes to touch her face, which would have been a much more romantic gesture. But instead he puts the hand on the shoulder, which shows that there's still some hesitancy there. And he's like, you can become happy. And she's like, oh, well, Tatsuya. And it feels so romantic. And he's like, will you promise to keep this a secret from everyone? Which at the time, he's like, sure. At the time, I was like, why are you all keeping a secret that you like each other? Why do you not want to date each other? Isn't that weird? I was like, is she trying to keep it a secret from Utena? But what she's actually doing is saying, will you keep it a secret that I like Saionji because he has a reputation at the school and he's a bad boy? And he's like, sure, of course. And I'm like, oh my God. And she's like, if it makes you embarrassed, we can make it our secret. And she's like, of course, that's what friends do. And then she's like, well, I still really can't believe it, but I found happiness, haven't I? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, I hope you hurry and find happiness with someone too. Like, she just friend zones him in that moment. And it was such a shock because the mood, the atmosphere, everything sets up that you think he's going to confess and they get together. But instead, he just gets friend zoned and reaffirms that she's like, yes, Saionji is the one I am going to go after. That's great. He is my prince. Oh my God. She's like, I can't make him wait forever. She like leaves to go get him, to go to him. She's like, well, who do you think? My prince. She's like, bye. And he's like, my prince. And then he does the same thing he did as a kid going, huh? Absolutely insane. Bait and switch, role reversal, lives were changed. I was like, that was such the most crazy reversal I did not see coming from a mile away. So then he goes to the consultancy and we find out that this place has a reputation. So we learn some things. We learn it has a reputation. We learn that at the reception booth, now notice he didn't have an appointment. So he didn't have it scheduled. And so he didn't fill out the little form, right? He's like, but would it still be okay? And he's like, I'm sorry for barging in like this. But he's like, as he goes down, he's like, I've heard the rumors that you have consultation for people that have problems. So that's how they're luring people there, right? And so then he basically goes through this and saying, like, when she was my princess, she was just mine alone. He's like, but she left me to go see another man. And he says, I'm sure she's being tricked, which we don't know at this point if she's being tricked or not, but she very could be. And then he's like, but she's such an innocent girl. And I'm sure he'll do all sorts of horrible things to her. Which, that's going to be the interesting thing, is if Tatsuya truly loves her, and he realizes now that she's moved on to someone else, but he's afraid that who she's moved on to will take advantage of her and hurt her, which Saionji doesn't have a great track record, for the record. So that could very well happen. And I'm going to be curious to see if Tatsuya, if he ends up confronting Saionji, and if that becomes a thing. I'm going to be so curious because he's all worried about her getting hurt. And he's like, but it doesn't matter. No matter how much she's tarnished, she'll come back to me. And he's like, yes, because love always wins in the end. And he's like, I would make you happy and sacrifice anything for your sake. And he's like, why can't it be me? And the thing of it is, it's like, it was you, but you left and you didn't confess and you lost your chance. So now the question is, he's like, as he's going through, he's like, well, would she come back to me? Am I going to still able to be friends with her? What are we going to do with that? What's going to happen because of it? And he's kind of going through the motions of what his options are. And it's like, yeah. So in a sense, basically, he's like, the thing about it is he does kind of get a little bit kind of twisted there for a second where he's like, well, even if she's tarnished, she'll come back to me. But then he flips the script and says that he would do anything for her and still love her. And he's mad that it can't be him that's loved in return. So he starts to go down the dark path, but then he reflects and still decides that he would do whatever for her and chooses to go the better route. And she's like, I'm sure she's being tricked. Okay. So then after that, Soji comes and says, you really are a good person, aren't you? And man, that moment that like Tatsuya is crying and looking up at him, he's like, there's no path for you to take here. That was so crazy too. The twist that Soji's like, you're a decent person. We can't use your heart. It's not black. You genuinely care about Wakaba and want what's best for her. Get out. We can't use that. And Soji looks rightfully disturbed in that moment. He's like, why are you here? Like, it just feels like you're not supposed to be here. Go away. It is honestly crazy. He's like, there's no path for you to take here. We can't use you. And he's like, go home. There's no place for someone like you. So I'm so curious. Like, what is Tatsuya going to do? Is he going to like try to do something to help Wakaba? Like, where are we going to go to? And then she runs back. And so we see her going through, I'm assuming the castle gates, but she goes to her dorm and standing there at the dorm when she says, "I'm home," and who's in the window that turns around? He says, "Welcome back." So did he get admitted back to the school? He's got his, like, it looks like his kendo gear on. His hair's up in the ponytail. What? Ah! So yeah, I don't know. I feel like next episode, if anything, needs to backtrack and be like, wait, how did we get here? Is Saionji back in the school? Did he get readmitted? Is she, how did we get here? What happened to get us to this point? And since Soji was like, we're not using you, get out, where does that leave Tatsuya? What's he gonna do? Is he gonna confront Saionji? What? Oh my God. I'm so excited for episode 20. I'm so freaking excited. I'm not going to watch the preview. Although, now that we've mentioned it, we do need to go back and check out the preview from episode 19, from episode 18, to know what it was saying to us, because we're going to pull this up here. And I'm going to turn, the sound's off. So I want to go back to the preview and see what it's going to say to us about the episode. So it says for episode 19, it says, a boy sent me a love letter. And then it says, he's an old friend of Wakaba-san's, Utena-sama. Then, if she's the princess of the Onion Kingdom, he must be the Onion Prince. Okay, well, all right. People kept saying that Wakaba was talking about the Onion Kingdom, and I was like, is this a spoiler? What is this? So now we've gotten to that point. Okay. All right, so with 2 onions, I can make a really delicious curry tonight. That's hilarious. That's amazing. What curry again? Next time on Revolutionary Girl Utena, Song of the Fallen Kingdom. What a crazy preview. I'm glad I'm not watching the previews because that would have been such a spoiler. Anyway, I'm going to wait for comments from this weekend. I'm going to hold off. We're going to see what we get. But it's going to be real hard to wait for episode 20, so you just wait and see. So anyway, I'm so excited. I hope you all are as well, but I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe. Take care. I hope you enjoyed this reaction discussion. Keep those comments a-coming, and I'll be back real soon with more Revolutionary Girl Utena. Bye.